Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Sí, por la pobreza, no hay, como le vuelvo a repetir, no hay oportunidades.
It's because of the poverty that people are migrating away from here. There are no opportunities here. The poverty we live in, the crops we grow, aren't enough to support a family.
The government remains partially shut down for a sixth day over President Trump's request for border wall funding. We go to the U.S.-Mexican border following the death of 2 Guatemalan children in 3 weeks in U.S. custody. We'll speak to Dylan Corbett of the Hope Border Institute, who's been assisting hundreds of migrant asylum seekers who've been dumped by ICE officials outside a Greyhound bus terminal in El Paso without any plan to house them. Then, as Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg is released from the hospital after lung cancer surgery, we revisit the documentary RBG. It's just been shortlisted for an Oscar.
In asking the court to declare sex a suspect criterion, we urge a position forcibly stated in 1837 by Sarah Grimke, noted abolitionist and advocate of equal rights for men and women. She said, "I ask no favor for my sex. All I ask of our brethren
is that they take their feet off our necks."
We'll speak to the directors of RBG, Betsy West and Julie Cohen. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Donald Trump paid a surprise visit Wednesday to a sprawling military base in western Iraq. Trump was joined by First Lady Melania Trump as the president posed for selfies with troops and autographed red "Make America Great Again" hats. It was Trump's first visit to an active war zone since he took office nearly 2 years ago. During a speech to troops, Trump defended his plans to withdraw all U.S. troops from Syria and about half the nearly 7,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan.
America shouldn't be doing the fighting for every nation on earth, not being reimbursed in many cases at all. If they want us to do the fighting, they also have to pay a price. And sometimes that's also a monetary price. So we're not the suckers of the world. We're no longer the suckers, folks. And people aren't looking at us as suckers.
But Trump said he has no plans to withdraw the more than 5,000 U.S. troops who remain in Iraq. During his brief trip, Trump did not meet with the Iraqi Prime Minister Adel Abdul-Mahdi or any other Iraqi officials. In a statement, a bloc of Iraqi parliamentarians condemned Trump's surprise visit as a, quote, flagrant and clear violation of diplomatic norms, unquote. President Trump's Iraq visit came as the New York Times reported that a podiatrist in Queens, New York, helped Donald Trump avoid the Vietnam War in 1968 as a favor to Trump's father, the real estate magnate Fred Trump. The foot doctor, Larry Brownstein, died in 2007, but his daughters told the New York Times their father often recounted how he helped Donald Trump get one of his 5 draft deferments with a diagnosis of bone spurs. In return, Dr. Brownstein was reportedly given direct access to his landlord, Fred Trump, who helped Brownstein quickly repair any problems with the building he rented from the Trump family. The federal government's entered a 6th day of partial shutdown with no resolution in sight, as President Trump continues to demand billions of dollars in new funding for an expanded wall on the U.S.-Mexico border. This is Trump responding to a reporter during his trip to Iraq on Wednesday.
Whatever it takes. I mean, we're going to have a wall. We're going to have safety. We need safety for our country, even from this standpoint. We have terrorists coming in through the southern border. We have the terrorists also coming in, fellas, through the southern border.
The shutdown has left some 800,000 federal workers either furloughed or working without pay during the Christmas holiday season. Meanwhile, funding has expired for programs aimed at helping women who've survived domestic violence and sexual assault. The Violence Against Women Act expired Saturday as the government shutdown took hold, and its programs will remain unfunded unless and until Congress reauthorizes it. In El Paso, Texas, immigration and customs enforcement officers released hundreds of migrants Wednesday night at a downtown bus station, bringing the number of people released this week to more than 1,000. Local nonprofits that assist the migrants said this time they were given some advance warning of the drop-offs, unlike over the Christmas holiday when ICE stranded hundreds of people in the cold, including young children, with no warning and no plans for accommodations. Immigration activists say the drop-offs were part of the Trump administration's deliberate strategy of sowing chaos at the border as a deterrent to asylum seekers. This is Dylan Corbett, director of the Hope Border Institute, an El Paso-based charity that assists migrants.
The majority of them don't even know that they're not in the hands of the government. Although we are a community group, the migrants don't know that with us, they are not in detention. They are not with CBP or ICE. They don't know anything. They need information. They need to get informed. Some of them don't even know they're in El Paso.
After headlines, we'll go to El Paso to speak with Dylan Corbett about the Trump administration's immigration policies. In Guatemala, friends and family of Jacqueline Calmaquin, the indigenous girl who died in U.S. Border Patrol custody on December 8th, mourned the 7-year-old at her funeral Christmas Day. About 150 people gathered around an open casket for the little girl before lowering her into the ground in the impoverished mountain village of San Antonio Socortes. Cal's mother was so despondent she couldn't bear to attend the funeral. The girl's uncle, Jose Manuel Cal, said poverty and hunger drove the girl's father to bring her to the United States to apply for asylum.
Sí, por la pobreza, no hay, como le vuelvo a repetir, no hay oportunidades.
It's because of the poverty that people are migrating away from here. There are no opportunities here. The poverty we live in, the crops we grow, aren't enough to support a family.
Jacqueline Cal died 2 days after crossing into the U.S. in a remote part of New Mexico, December 6th. She had a fever of nearly 106 degrees at the time of her death. It was actually December 8th. Human rights groups and Democratic lawmakers have demanded an impartial, independent investigation into her death. We'll have more on that story after headlines. This comes as a new ProPublica investigation found pervasive sexual assaults at detention centers for immigrant children, with both staff and other residents sometimes acting as predators. In one case, a youth care worker in Arizona who was convicted of molesting 7 boys spent months working at a detention center without a full background check. In Sudan, human rights groups say government forces have killed at least 37 people as protesters continue to demand the ouster of longtime authoritarian President Omar al-Bashir. On Tuesday, government forces opened fire with tear gas and live ammunition on peaceful protesters in the capital, Khartoum, as they chanted, "The people want to bring down the regime," a popular slogan during the Arab Spring uprisings. Similar scenes have played out in cities across Sudan in recent days. The protests erupted after al-Bashir's government ended subsidies for fuel and wheat, causing bread prices to triple, even as Sudan's inflation rate nears 70%. Russian President Vladimir Putin said Wednesday Russia's military will begin deploying a new hypersonic missile capable of delivering nuclear warheads at 20 times the speed of sound. Putin called a recent successful test of the missile system a perfect New Year's gift for the country.
The
new Avangard missile system is invincible for today's and future air defense systems and missile defense systems. This is a big success and a big victory.
Russia's reported successful test of its new hypersonic missile came after the Trump administration said in October it plans to leave the INF, or Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, signed in 1987 by former President Ronald Reagan and Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev. The treaty helped to eliminate thousands of land-based missiles in Europe. In Yemen, a United Nations official tasked with overseeing a fragile ceasefire in the strategic port city of Hodeidah is calling on Houthi rebels and fighters with Yemen's Saudi-backed government to maintain their truce. Patrick Comert, a retired Dutch general, spoke to representatives of the warring parties after a UN team arrived in the besieged city on Monday.
If you read the agreement, the timelines are very tight. That means that the ceasefire started on the 18th of December at midnight, which is extremely important that both sides are holding that, and that both sides show not the blame you and he blames him and everybody blames everybody. Breaking a ceasefire is going back and not forward.
The ceasefire has largely held since it began December 18th. Humanitarian groups warn a return to fighting could cut off shipments of desperately needed food and aid, as half of Yemen's 28 million people are on the brink of famine. Israel's defense ministry has advanced plans to construct 2,200 new homes in a Jewish-only settlement in the occupied West Bank. Israel's continued settlement expansion violates international law and multiple UN resolutions. This comes as Israel's parliament, the Knesset, formally set April 9th as the date for a new election after the right-wing coalition government led by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu collapsed. Japan's government said Wednesday it's pulling out of the International Whaling Commission and will resume commercial whaling. The move ends a program that allowed Japanese vessels to hunt and kill whales on a limited basis under the pretext of scientific research. This is Japan's cabinet secretary announcing the withdrawal on Wednesday.
Japan's basic policy of promoting sustainable use of aquatic living resources based on scientific evidence has not changed. And under that policy, we have decided to resume commercial whaling.
In a statement, Greenpeace condemned the move and called on Japan to recommit to the International Whaling Commission. But the anti-whaling direct action group Sea Shepherd hailed the withdrawal a victory that would end Japanese whaling in the Antarctic, while revealing Japan as a pirate whaling nation. Sea Shepherd pledged its boats would continue to confront Japanese whaling vessels on the high seas. The actor Kevin Spacey has been charged with sexually assaulting a teenager in a bar in Massachusetts in 2016. Spacey's due in court January 7th to face a felony charge that could bring him up to 5 years in prison. Kevin Spacey has denied the charges. On Monday, he posted a cryptic video on social media posing as the character as Frank Underwood from the Netflix show House of Cards, where he spent 5 seasons before he was fired after more than a dozen men accused Spacey of sexually harassing or assaulting them. And in Buena, New Jersey, the family of African-American high school wrestler Andrew Johnson says racism drove a white referee to demand that the teenager cut his dreadlocks before he could compete in a match. Video of the incident, taken just before the December 19th match, shows a sports trainer publicly and clumsily cutting the hair of the 16-year-old student-athlete, who's dressed in a wrestling uniform and is visibly shaken to have his dreadlocks sheared off. Johnson was told he had just 90 seconds to agree to the haircut, or he would be forced to forfeit the match. Just out of the frame of the video, which has since gone viral, the referee, Alan Maloney, demanded the trainer keep cutting Johnson's hair until he was satisfied with its length. Maloney had arrived late to the match and missed a weigh-in where referees would typically raise objections to a wrestler's appearance. In 2016, the ref, Alan Maloney, admitted he used the N-word during a conversation with other sports officials and later apologized for the racist slur. In a statement issued through their lawyer, Johnson's family said, quote, "The blame here rests primarily with the referee and those that permitted him to continue in that role despite clear evidence of what should be a disqualifying race-related transgression," unquote. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. U.S. Customs and Border Protection have ordered medical checks on every child in its custody following the death of 2 Guatemalan children in recent weeks. On Christmas Eve, an 8-year-old Guatemalan boy named Felipe Gomez Alonso died in New Mexico while in CBP custody. The child was admitted to a hospital earlier on Christmas Eve, diagnosed with a common cold, given ibuprofen and antibiotics, and released. But the boy continued continued to become more ill throughout the day. After he began vomiting, the boy was sent back to the same hospital but fell unconscious along the way. He was pronounced dead 12 minutes before Christmas. The cause of death is not yet known. The boy was first detained along with his father on December 18th after they crossed the border west of El Paso, Texas. This follows the death of a 7-year-old indigenous Guatemalan girl, Jacqueline Cal Maquin, who died on December 8th, also in New Mexico, 2 days after she and her father presented themselves at the border in a bid for asylum. On Christmas Day, about 150 people gathered for her funeral in the impoverished Guatemalan mountain village of San Antonio Secortes.
In more immigration news, authorities in El Paso, Texas, scrambled over the Christmas holiday to assist hundreds of migrant asylum seekers who were dumped suddenly by ICE officials outside a Greyhound bus terminal without any plan to house them. Local shelters say they weren't told in advance of ICE's plans, as is customary, leaving them struggling to find accommodations for hundreds of migrants, including young children. On Sunday, Greyhound brought in buses where migrants could shelter overnight into the Christmas Eve holiday. Sergeant Robert Gomez of the El Paso Police Department said, "We weren't going to put 200 people on the streets of El Paso on a cold night. We wouldn't do that," he said. On Wednesday night, immigration authorities released hundreds of more migrants at a downtown El Paso bus station, bringing the number of people released this week to more than 1,000. Well, for more, we're going to El Paso, Texas, where we're joined by Dylan Corbett, Executive Director of Hope Border Institute. Dylan, welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us. Can you explain what's been happening in El Paso? Why are so many hundreds of migrants being dumped at the bus station by ICE?
Sure. You know, it's rather confusing what's been going on since the 23rd of December, so just a couple of days before Christmas. What happened is ICE began to release, effectively, as you say, dump many migrants downtown on a cold night in El Paso. These were migrants who had just come from CBP cells across our border community. And when they were released confused, they were released hungry, they were tired, they had been in very difficult and cramped conditions in cells, Border Patrol cells and CBP cells, and many of them were sick. Now, it's inexplicable as to why ICE chose to do this. Normally, there's a lot of cooperation between the government and the network of migrant shelters here in El Paso, led by Annunciation House, which does stellar work in providing for the humanitarian needs of migrants who are released into our community. But ICE chose not to do this around the Christmas holiday. On the 23rd, they released 200 people at night. The following day, on Christmas Eve, they released another 200 folks. And then on Christmas Day, they continued to do it and released 200 folks. Yesterday, they suspended that practice, and 500 folks were released into our community, but there was greater collaboration with the network of migrant shelters here in El Paso. We hope that this isn't something that repeats itself. This has never happened. The only other time that this happened was the week before elections at the very end of October. So it's hard not to see a political character to this. It's hard not to see that the administration is deliberately trying to foment the image of a crisis at the border that frankly doesn't exist, that's manufactured in Washington.
So with this as the backdrop, let's look at the death of 2 Guatemalan children in 3 weeks in U.S. custody. This horrific example of Felipe Gomez Alonso. He was the second of the 2 children, who on Christmas Eve, explain what you understand happened. He had come over the border with his dad. He was held by Border Patrol it was just under a week. How did he get sick and die? What is happening? This, of course, you're in El Paso. He was in New Mexico. He died in an Alamogordo hospital.
Sure. You know, the case of Felipe Alonso Gomez, an 8-year-old Guatemalan boy who died on Christmas Eve, was chilling to me because on Christmas Day, when ICE released 200 migrants, all of them were families. All of them were fathers with children or mothers with children. When they released those children off the bus, when they essentially kicked them off the bus into downtown El Paso, one of those kids, who was about 7 or 8 years old, the same age as Felipe Alonso Gonzalez, the same age as Jacqueline Cal, probably from Guatemala, was feverish and was dehydrated. Thank God, nearby there were local fire department. There was a local fire department, and they were able to offer first aid to that child, and we were able to send him to a hospital in an ambulance. But these children are being held in conditions. These families are being held in terrible conditions in CBP Border Patrol cells, anywhere between 4 and 8 days before they're released into either ICE custody, or if they're claiming asylum in their families, they're released into our community. The conditions are not good. We're hearing from migrants that they're very cramped conditions. Many people in very small cells. People not having the ability to bathe for several days. Food is minimal. Access to the bathroom is minimal. They're telling us that they're not even able to go to the bathroom with any degree of privacy. So in these conditions, it's to be expected that children are going to get sick. And that's what we saw with Jacqueline Cal in the beginning of December, that she presented dehydration symptoms, that she presented a very high fever, and she had been in the Border Patrol custody for several hours, almost 9 hours, before she finally expired. Felipe Alonso Gonzalez was apprehended close by here in El Paso, just a few miles outside our community, and yet he was taken from here to a Border Patrol checkpoint, a highway checkpoint about 100 miles away in Alamogordo. Now, why that's unacceptable is because children are not supposed to be in Border Patrol checkpoints on the highway. Those facilities are not appropriate for children. I hope that did not contribute to his sickness. I hope that did not contribute to his death. But we should not be holding children and families in these conditions. This has been going on for a long time. Unfortunately, I think this was to be expected. It's unfortunate that we've got to this point where there have been the death of 2 children before the government is starting to act. It's sad that it had to come to this. But we need institutional reform now. We need actions on the part of CBP to guarantee the safety and security of the families and children in their custody.
Well, on December 20th, Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen was grilled at a heated congressional hearing about the Trump administration's border and immigration policies. She was questioned by Democratic Congress members David Cicilline of Rhode Island and Hank Johnson of Georgia.
How many children 17 years old or younger have died in DHS, ICE, or CBP custody since you took office?
I will get back to you on that figure. What I can tell you is that we have saved 4,200 migrants who are at distress due to their
Approximately how many have died?
I understand your question, sir. I will get back to you.
Can you give me an approximate figure?
I will get back to you. I'm not going to guess under oath.
As you sit here today, you do not know how many human beings have died while in the custody of the department that you lead. And you, in preparation for today's hearing, you didn't ascertain that number, but you don't know it today?
I don't have an exact figure for you.
Do you have a rough idea?
Sir, what I can tell you
I'm
is...
talking about people who have died in your custody. You don't have the number?
I will get back to you with the number.
Okay.
Congressman Johnson went on to ask Nielsen, do you view those you call illegal aliens to be human or subhuman? So, Dylan, could you respond to what Kirstjen Nielsen said and what she didn't say?
Yeah. You know, that's absolutely unacceptable that the Secretary for the Department of Homeland Security doesn't know how many children have died in her custody. But that's a piece with the lack of transparency. That's a piece with the lack of accountability in these institutions. ICE and CBP are rife with the lack of accountability and transparency. Something else that's very troubling that has to do with the death of Jacqueline Cal. CBP, under federal law, is obliged to inform Congress within 24 hours if a child dies in their custody. Commissioner McAleenan of the CBP did not do that. He did not inform Congress until several days later, effectively breaking the law. If DHS cannot guarantee the safety and security of the families and the children in their custody, if they're not going to be accountable to Congress at this point, I don't see how the CBP commissioner or how the DHS secretary can't be called on to resign at this point.
Well, Dylan, can you explain what, just clarify, have children ever died in ICE custody before, during the Obama administration?
This is something that's new. Adults have died while in custody, but this is something new, and this is something that's troubling. CBP effectively is not able to guarantee their health or security. The conditions in which they're in, the cells in which they're in, are not meant to house families. It's true that what we've seen, although when you look at the past 30, 40 years, we're at a relative low in terms of border crossings, it's true that what's happened lately, as of late, is that there are the number of families crossing the border has spiked. Last month, November, 60% of all border apprehensions were families. But what the government's response has been in the Trump administration, and what the government's response has been over the last several decades, this is bipartisan, this is on both the presidents and the Congress, has been respond to the problem of immigration at the border by criminalizing migrants and by militarizing the border. So it was to be expected when your only response is to criminalize people, when your only response is to deploy racism, when your only response is to militarize, that you can't respond to a humanitarian situation like we have right now. CBP, despite their incredible budgets, despite the incredible resources that they have, despite 18,000 Border Patrol agents here at the border, we are unable to respond to what is actually happening at the border because we're treating migrants as criminals and threats to our country, which they're not. These are families seeking refuge, safety, and security, and they're being driven by forced migration, a lot of which the United States is complicit in.
I want to turn to Democratic Congressmember Luis Gutierrez of Illinois. He addressed Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen at that December 20th hearing.
Specifically in the area of Homeland Security, lying has become elevated to an astounding level of mendacity. President Trump descended the golden escalators at Trump Tower to announce his candidacy by saying Mexico was sending us the worst rapists, murderers. Then he said he was required to break up migrant families because of bad laws that the Democrats gave us. How about the one about Mexico paying for the wall? You want $5 million and you want $5 billion and you want the American public to pay for it. Isn't Mexico supposed to pay for it? Wasn't that the campaign promise? No, that's just another lie. But I have to say the all-time record for lying in the face of all the evidence was a tweet you, Madam Secretary, sent out on June the 17th. And it says, "We do not have a policy of separating families at the border, period." That's your Twitter account. That's what you put out. Yet you came here today to tell us exactly is your policy of separating families and children from their families. Another lie. I know I have 45 seconds. I won't take them all. But it is repugnant to me and astonishing to me that during Christmas, I like to call them the holiday seasons to be inclusive, but during Christmas, because the majority always wants to just call it Christmas, that during Christmas, a time in which we celebrate the birth of Jesus Christ, a Jesus Christ who had to flee for his life with Mary and Joseph. Thank God there wasn't a wall that stopped him from seeking refuge in Egypt.
That was Congressmember Luis Gutierrez, after which he walked out of the hearing with the head of the Department of Homeland Security, Kirstjen Nielsen, as Congressmember after Congressmember demanded to know how many people had died in border custody. She refused to answer. Afterwards, they did release a number. They said in the last year, from October 1st, 2017 to September 30th, 2018, 6 adults have died. And since October 1st, 2 children have died. So, Dylan Corbett, is it true that what's happening right now is that migrants are being picked up, immigrants are being picked up with such speed to be deported, and they need those ICE detention centers to put them in on their way to deportation, that the children and other immigrants who are not supposed to be in BPS custody for BPC custody for more than 72 hours are being held much longer and, as you said, in much more primitive conditions.
Yeah, that's true. And what we're seeing, you mentioned at the top of the program that we were in the midst of a government shutdown. This is a government shutdown that has been instigated by President Trump over precisely border funding for the border wall, increased militarization of the border. What we've seen over 2018 was zero tolerance, with placing agents, there are currently agents here on the bridges in El Paso, Texas, preventing people from lawfully accessing asylum, pushing them away, and forcing them to go to more remote and dangerous parts of the border where they have to cross illegally in more precarious conditions. That's exactly what happened to Jacqueline Cal. Jacqueline Cal and her father would not have been allowed to present at the bridge and ask for asylum. They were forced to go into more remote parts of the border. That is something that directly contributed to her death. We've also seen, as you said, we heard about family separation. This year, over 2,000 children were separated from their families. Family separation continues. There was a gentleman and his a migrant father and his child who I saw just a couple days ago who was kicked off the bus by ICE, who had been separated from his spouse. Family separation continues to happen. We have the reality of Tornillo, the detention camp just miles outside of El Paso. This politicization of the border, these border politics, shutting down the government in order to get your way on militarizing the border, what we're seeing is all these different tactics, all these different policies and practices by CBP, by ICE, by the Department of Homeland Security, stemming from decisions that are being taken in the White House, are now having deadly consequences. People have to wake up to the fact that this is not, we do not need a militarized response here on the border. We need to demilitarize, we need to defund, and we need to treat people with dignity and respect, recognizing that we are responsible for their forced migration out of countries like Guatemala, where Jacqueline and Felipe come from.
And of course, you have the situation where President Trump has shut down the government over getting $5 billion for the border wall. And in this shutdown, hundreds, if not thousands, I don't know, of CBP border agents are not being paid. They're part of the program of their salaries being cut at this point to be paid in the future.
That's right. And it's all about, a border wall. And the border wall, it has to be said, this is not a solution to a problem. This is an invented solution to a problem that doesn't exist. The border wall will not make us more safe. El Paso, Texas, I'm right on the border. Outside my window, I can see our sister city of Ciudad Juarez in Mexico. We are one of the safest cities in the country. We don't need a border wall to keep us safe. Terrorists have not passed through our southern border. A border wall will not address the drivers of migration. People will continue to come from countries like Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador until we address the root causes of migration.
Dylan, we want to thank you very much for being with us. And of course, CBP is Customs and Border Protection. That's what it stands for. Dylan Corbett, Executive Director of Hope Border Institute in El Paso, Texas. When we come back, Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg has just been released from the hospital after cancer surgery. She voted from her bed in a Supreme Court decision this past Friday. We'll get the latest on her condition and talk about her life. Stay with us. Space by composer Galt McDermott. McDermott died last week, a day shy of his 90th birthday. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg has been discharged from the hospital following surgery for lung cancer. She's recovering from the procedure at home. She was hospitalized last week at the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York, where surgeons on Friday removed 2 malignant growths in her left lung. Doctors called the surgery a success and said there's no sign that Ginsburg cancer has spread. While in hospital Friday, Ginsburg cast her vote, blocking the Trump administration's asylum ban. The health of the liberal 85-year-old justice, the oldest sitting justice on the Supreme Court bench, has come under increased scrutiny in recent years. In November, she was hospitalized after a fall that resulted in 3 fractured ribs. She previously fractured 2 ribs in 2012 and has twice survived cancer, pancreatic cancer in 2009 and colon cancer in 1999.
Despite her illnesses in her 25 years on the bench, Justice Ginsburg has never missed a day of oral argument. The court next meets on January 7th. Her return home on Christmas Day coincided with the release of the biopic of her film titled On the Basis of Sex. But we turn now to a remarkable award-winning documentary released earlier this year at the Sundance Film Festival. The film has just been shortlisted for an Academy Award for Best Documentary. It's called RBG. This is the trailer.
I ask no favor for my sex. All I ask of our brethren is that they take their feet off our necks.
We welcome today Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
She's become such an icon.
Do you mind signing this copy?
I am 84 years old, and everyone wants to take a picture with me.
Notorious RBG. Yeah.
When you come right down to it, the closest thing to a superhero I know.
Ruth Bader Ginsburg changed the way the world is for American women.
I became a lawyer when women were not wanted by the legal profession.
Thousands of state and federal laws discriminated on the basis of gender. She was following in the footsteps of the battle for racial equality. She wanted equal protection for women.
Men and women are persons of equal dignity, and they should count equally before the law.
She captured for the male members of the court what it was like to be a second-class citizen.
The point is that the discriminatory line almost inevitably hurts women.
I did see myself as kind of a kindergarten teacher in those days because the judges didn't think sex discrimination existed.
I have had the great good fortune to share life with a partner truly extraordinary for his generation.
He was the first boy I ever knew who cared that I had a brain.
She is a center of power on and off the court.
Every time Justice Ginsburg wrote a dissent, the internet would explode.
I came up with a couple slogans. You can't spell truth without Ruth.
I surely would not be in this room today without the determined efforts of men and women who kept dreams alive.
The trailer for RBG. We're joined now by the film's directors, Betsy West and Julie Cohen. We welcome you back to Democracy Now! Julie, let's begin with you with the latest on Ruth Bader Ginsburg's condition. She was just released from the hospital, but tell us what's happened.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I'm not an oncologist, but we do know that Justice Ginsburg had the 2 cancerous nodules removed from her lung. Actually, a lobe of her lung was removed. You've got 5 lobes in your lungs, and one of them now the justice has had removed. Got out of the hospital after just a few days, about 5 days total in the hospital, and is now resting, recovering, and with a view towards being on the bench as soon as possible. Note that she scheduled her surgery for the Friday before a long holiday. It's a long tradition that she has. It's done the same thing with chemotherapy. With the idea that you want to have as little possible work downtime so that you can get right back to work.
Friday was a very busy day. She both had the operation, but she also ruled, participated in a Supreme Court vote, and talk about the significance of that.
Right. I mean, all 9 justices had to vote on this brief order that came out, ended up with a 5-4 vote. The question, there's a lot of double negatives, so I'll just, basically the question was, does Donald Trump's administration's asylum ban, the restrictions on asylum for immigrants, stand while during the period that the courts are trying to work out the merits of the issue? And the court voted 5-4 that the ban does not stand, with Roberts voting with the court's liberal wing on this procedural issue. But a 5-4 vote is a reminder of the huge importance of each of those 9 votes and the importance of Justice Ginsburg weighing in even during her illness.
Well, as news of her surgery became public, supporters took to Twitter with messages like, "She can have my lung, hell, she can even have both of them." Earlier this year, fans similarly tweeted messages of support when RBG was hospitalized after a fall that fractured her 3 ribs. At the time, actress Alyssa Milano wrote, quote, "Ruth Bader Ginsburg can have my ribs and my kidneys and a lung and anything else she needs. She can even have my husband on Thursdays." So that was Alyssa Milano's tweets, and then tweets that came out last week as news of her, earlier this week as news of her surgery spread. So Betsy West, could you explain why her position on the Supreme Court now is so crucial?
Well, you know, Nina Totenberg cracked that maybe we could solve the organ donation problem in this country by taking all of those offers. And, you know, Justice Ginsburg has become a rallying cry for many people in this country who are dismayed by the Supreme Court's move to the right. And obviously, as Julie just said, the court is now divided very narrowly. And the fact that Chief Justice Roberts joined with the 4 liberal justices doesn't always happen. And there are many decisions that come down, they're expected to come down 5-4, 5 on the conservative side. So she is critical. People see her longevity as absolutely necessary in this time.
Well, she also just recently, she hired 2 law clerks for at least 2 more terms. So the idea is that she will stay till 2020 in her own
Well,
view.
yes. I mean, she keeps moving the goalpost here, and she had said that in addition to hiring her clerks for the coming 2 years, which is something that you don't have to do, she's now started talking about 90 is a goal for her to retire. She's 85 now, so that gives her another 5 years. You know, you mentioned all of her illnesses. It's funny in a way, because when Julie and I were following her around the country, you wouldn't have known that this was a frail person. She has, yes, she's small, she's diminutive, she's kind of bent over, but she has extraordinary stamina, and she sometimes tired us out, frankly, by the end of the day. We were ready to go to bed, and she was like, oh, let's, you know, she'd say, I'm going to go back and do a little bit of work.
We're going to go to a break and then really recap her life, talk about her history of activism, legal prowess, how she came to be on the Supreme Court and has served there for the last quarter of a century. We're talking to Betsy West and Julie Cohen. They are the directors of the now Oscar-nominated documentary, RBG. Stay with us.
Ruth Bader Ginsburg, you're my favorite justice on the Supreme Court. Will you marry me? Ruth Bader Ginsburg, you bring the rulings and I'll bring a little tour. On the side of fairness there you'll be,
Ruth Bader Ginsburg by Anne Reed. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. We're talking about the health of and the life of Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the Supreme Court for the last 25 years. And we're speaking with the directors of a documentary that's just been shortlisted for an Oscar. We will see what happens. The shortlist is 15 documentaries, and the nomination process that happens by the end of January will lead to 5 documentaries chosen. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, though, was nominated by President Clinton in 1993. During her Senate confirmation hearing, she openly defended a woman's right to have an abortion.
This is something central to a woman's life, to her dignity. It's a decision that she must make for herself. And when government controls that decision for her, she is being treated as less than a fully adult human responsible for her own choices.
So during Ginsburg's 1993 Supreme Court confirmation hearing, Republican Senator Orrin Hatch of Utah questioned her on abortion.
Yesterday you endorsed the so-called constitutional right to abortion, a right which many, including myself, think was created out of thin air by the court.
But you asked me the question in relation to the Supreme Court's precedent, and you've now asked me another question in relation to the Supreme Court's precedent. The Supreme Court's precedent is that access to abortion is part of the liberty guaranteed by the 14th Amendment.
Well, that was just reaffirmed by...
So that's Ruth Bader Ginsburg in 1993 during her confirmation hearing. She was ultimately confirmed 96-3, and among the people who voted to confirm her was Orrin Hatch, who's anti-choice.
Yes, we spoke with Senator Hatch for the documentary. We wondered if in any way he regretted that vote or he wanted to, make any qualifications. And he's a very staunch Republican. But I have to say, he told us, I love Justice Ginsburg. He made the point during the hearings that he disagreed with her on some issues, but not with her qualifications to be a justice. He said, look, she was appointed by a liberal president. He has that right, and she deserves to be on the court. It's obviously a very different time.
Well, one of the things that you document so well in the film is her relationship, her very close friendship with Antonin Scalia.
Yes.
So, I mean, it says something. If you could talk a little bit about where she fell or she falls politically, and what people, and in the documentary you point this out too, that she's kind of an accommodationist, right? She works with both conservatives and liberals.
Well, she's very collegial. I would say that she is on the ideological opposite side to Justice Scalia, but she's a person who believes in talking about your differences, in not and in having a good relationship with all of her colleagues on the court. Let's face it, it's only 9 of them, and they're in that chamber and they're talking, and she's very practical. How is she going to convince people to come over to her side if they're mad at her, if they don't like her? I think she, many people said to us beforehand, oh, she's not really friends with Justice Scalia. How could she be friends with a guy like that? And the reality is that they were extremely good friends. She really loved, they shared opera in common. They both loved opera.
And acted in opera.
And they acted, together, appeared in an opera, went to lots of opera, talked about opera all the time. And, she loved his sense of humor. And I think more than that, she respected him intellectually and felt that talking things over with him actually sharpened her own arguments.
I want to turn to another clip from your documentary, RBG, where Justice Ginsburg talks about the first time she argued before the Supreme Court in the case Frontiero versus Richardson in 1972. The case centered on a female Air Force lieutenant who'd been denied the same housing and medical benefits as her male colleagues. Ginsburg argued the Air Force's statute for housing allowances treated women as inferior, and the Supreme Court ruled in her favor 8-1.
There was not a single question. I just went on speaking, and I, at the time, wondered, are they just indulging me and not listening? Or am I telling them something they haven't heard before, and are they paying attention?
The justices were just glued to her. I don't think they were expecting to have to deal with something as powerful as a sheer force of her argument that was just all-encompassing. And they were there to talk about a little statute in the government code. I mean, it was just, we seized the moment to change American society.
In asking the court to declare sex a suspect criterion, we urge a position forcibly stated in 1837 by Sarah Grimke, noted abolitionist and advocate of equal rights for men and women. She said, "I ask no favor for my sex.
All I ask of our brethren is that they take their feet off our necks."
An excerpt from RBG, the documentary. In that clip, we also heard from Brenda Fegan, who was co-director with Ginsburg of the ACLU's Women's Rights Project. Julie, if you can talk more about her activism, her legal prowess. She went to Harvard, left Harvard. Everything she did, she had to challenge her way because her husband moved to New York. I mean, she was first in her class at Harvard, but she had to leave because they wouldn't let her go to school there from New York.
Right. She wanted to finish her senior year at Columbia Law School, which in fact she did, and graduated from Columbia. You know, the number of obstacles that RBG has faced in her life, personal, legal, societal, are absolutely enormous. The fascinating thing about her, and really what prompted Betsy and I to make this film about her, is as much as people are interested in her now and obsessed with her current notorious RBG persona, the story of her history and what she achieved for equal rights for women under the U.S. Constitution was, in our view, kind of not as widely known as it should be. It's an incredible story. It's one of those pieces of history that somehow gets left out of the school books. Like how is it not common knowledge how women's equal rights under the law were achieved? Well, a big part of how they were achieved was Ruth Bader Ginsburg, as a young lawyer working for the ACLU Women's Rights Project, which she was a co-founder of, arguing 6 cases before the U.S. Supreme Court, arguing that under the Equal Protection Clause, men and women should be equals. Seems now like actually not such a radical proposition. At the time she was arguing these cases in the early 70s, believe you me, it was a radical notion. She took that idea and made it real, and also made it kind of a mainstream concept. Yes, women and men should be equal under the law.
But she also felt that the battle not only had to be waged in the courts. And I wanted to turn to a moment at the RBG premiere at the Sundance Film Festival earlier this year, when you all came out after the film. And it was quite something because Justice Ginsburg was there, I believe, seeing the film for the first time. And she, too, came down to the front of the theater. And I had a chance to ask Justice Ginsburg about the Me Too movement and the continuing fight for gender equality. As you flew into Sundance on Saturday, thousands of women around the country were marching, rallying, and saying, "Me Too," and "Time's Up." And I'm wondering your thoughts on this movement, and whether that demand you made so many decades ago you feel still stands. Take the boots off our necks.
I was glad to see that happen because the march, first march, Women's March, was hugely attended, and I wondered whether it would stop with that or whether the movement would continue. And I think yesterday was proof that it will continue. The more women who are out there doing things, the better off all of us will be for it. That's something that my dear colleague, Sandra Day O'Connor, often said. The responsibility of women, of all of it is to get out there and to make a good show. And the more women who are out there doing things, the more younger women will have the courage to go on. I'm heartened by the number of women who will be in races for Congress and governorships and state legislative positions. So it was a favorite expression of Martin Luther King. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And I added to that, yes, if there are people who will strive with all their might to see it happen.
And there is Ruth Bader Ginsburg speaking about the importance of movements, Betsy. Of course, it was before this election, as she is referring to the significance of elections. And famously, though she apologized for it, ahead of the 2016 election, Justice Ginsburg called Donald Trump a faker who says whatever comes into his head at the moment.
Well, yes, she later said that she regretted having made those comments, but I think it's so interesting to see her take on the world. She's a very optimistic person, and she's looking at the women who are running, and she's saying, look, here's some progress. Look what's going to happen. She's kind of predicted we now have over 100 women who are going to be going into Congress. It's still not parity, but it is an improvement over what it was, and I think that's kind of the way Justice Ginsburg approaches everything. She's in the minority now, and she says, I'd rather be writing majority opinions, but if I have to, I'll write in dissent. She'll do her job, and I find it poignant and kind of inspiring the way she's always got the half-glass full approach to life.
And working out. I mean, the reason they found the tumors right on her lungs is that she fell in her offices at the Supreme Court, and she broke some ribs, but that actually may well have saved her.
Absolutely, because it led to the scans in which these nodules on her lung were detected.
But just the week before, she was planking, right? She was working out.
All the time.
Just before she was planking, and actually in between.
But explain what that means for people who don't know.
Do you want me to just demonstrate on the table? Planking is what you put yourself in a prone position and rest on your toes. It really works out your abs.
Works out with the trainer.
Justice Ginsburg works out with her personal trainer, Brian Johnson, whose main fitness training is actually with members of, with soldiers, because he's in the U.S. Army Reserves. He says, and he's not being facetious, that Justice Ginsburg is tougher than the young soldiers that he works out, because she never gives him any lip. He tells her to do something, and she just wants to get it right. Between the rib fracture and this recent cancer surgery, she was back in the gym, trying to keep herself fit.
And you two are paving the way with being a women-led team who did this documentary. It's what the 22nd most successful documentary of all time. Congratulations! You just won the DuPont Columbia Award. And are shortlisted for an Oscar. So congratulations to both of you. Very significant film. It's streaming also on Hulu now.
Yes. Right. Yes. Thank you.
Betsy West and Julie Cohen, directors and producers of the documentary RBG. To see our hour with them at Sundance, you can go to DemocracyNow.org. That does it for our broadcast. Democracy Now! Is a media job opening for a full-time social media manager here in New York. Resumes go to DemocracyNow.org. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Carla Wills, Tammy Warrenoff, Sam Alkoff, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Hani Massoud, Sharina Nadura, Tay Marie Astudio, and Libby Rainey. I'm Amy Goodman with Herman Shea.